When something older than the warp itself stirs beneath a forgotten ocean, even demons learn to fear. The Mechanicus found structures carved before humanity walked upright, and glyphs that rewrite minds just by being seen. Deep in the black water, something vast is waking, and it does not answer to chaos. How do you kill a god that was already dead when your galaxy was born? The ocean world of Nyrath Deep turned beneath a sky the color of iron and ash, its surface a churning expanse of black water that had never known sunlight in 10,000 years. The planet hung in the outer reaches of the ghoul stars, a forgotten pearl in a necklace of dead systems where even the Astronomican's light faltered and died. Beneath those lightless waves, something older than the Imperium had begun to wake, and the galaxy would learn that there were horrors beyond even the warp's infinite cruelty. Magos Lex Mechanic Thale Saroon stood upon the observation deck of the Resolute Quantifier, watching the abyssal waters through reinforced armor glass 6 meters thick. The viewport spanned the width of the deck, a cathedral window looking out upon damnation. Thale's mechadendrites twitched with involuntary input feedback loops as his augmetic optics cycled through 17 different spectrums, each one revealing nothing but darkness and the occasional bioluminescent horror drifting through depths that should have been sterile and empty. The expedition had been authorized by Mars itself after deep-range augers detected anomalous gravitic distortions emanating from Nyrath Deep's ocean trenches. The readings suggested archaeotech of significant value, possibly pre-imperial in origin, and the Mechanicus could no more ignore such a possibility than a starving man could ignore the scent of roasting meat. Thale had assembled a modest fleet, 3 Mechanicus vessels, 2 Imperial Navy escorts, and a complement of Skitarii sufficient to establish beachheads on whatever substrata platforms the ocean floor might offer. But the augurs had lied, or perhaps they had told a truth that human minds were not equipped to interpret. Thale's internal chronometer marked the 43rd hour since orbital insertion. The expedition's drill ships had penetrated 7 kilometers beneath the ocean's surface when the first anomalies manifested. Vox transmissions from the leading vessel, the submersible designated Omega-7, had degraded into static-wrapped fragments that sounded less like interference and more like speech in a language that predated linguistic structures. 3 crew members aboard Omega-7 had suffered catastrophic neural hemorrhaging. Their brains, the chirurgeons reported, had simply liquefied inside their skulls. No pathogen, no psychic assault, just dissolution. Thale's superior, Magos Explorator Urul Grend, had ordered the drill ships to continue. The machine spirits of their cogitators sang hymns of compliance and pressed deeper into the crushing dark, where pressure alone should have killed anything living. But life persisted in Nyrath Deep's abyssal zones, vast and bloated things that defied taxonomic classification, creatures whose bodies seemed to occupy more space than their physical dimensions should allow. The deck trembled. Servitors at their stations emitted flatline binary cant as systems across the ship experienced micro-failures too subtle for baseline human senses, but glaring to Mechanicus protocols. Thale's olfactory receptors detected the scent of scorched insulation and the faint chemical signature of coolant leak somewhere in the ventral decks. The Voxcaster crackled. Magos Gren's voice emerged, each syllable rendered through multiple layers of modulation and scramble coding. Lex Mechanic Saroon. Presence requested in the primary laboratorium. Priority absolute. The drill ships have made contact. Thale's pulse, that vestigial organic rhythm he had not yet replaced with a superior hydraulic pump, accelerated. Contact meant discovery. Discovery meant knowledge. Knowledge was the only currency that mattered. He turned from the viewport and crossed the observation deck in 14 precisely measured strides, his robes trailing behind him like the vestments of some techno-priest from an age when Mars still breathed atmosphere untainted by forge smoke. The corridors of the Resolute Quantifier stretched before him, illuminated by flickering lumen strips that cast everything in shades of amber and crimson. Servitors shuffled past, their lobotomized brains humming with simple tasks, their augmented bodies carrying cargo or performing maintenance routines that would continue until their organic components rotted away and their mechanical parts seized. The primary laboratorium occupied the ship's central axis, a vast chamber lined with analysis cogitators, dissection tables, and specimen containment vessels that could hold anything from microscopic viral strains to xenos predators the size of battle tanks. Magos Gren stood at the center of the chamber before a hololith projector that cast a three-dimensional representation of Nyrath Deep's ocean floor in ghostly green light. Gren's form was more machine than man, his original body long since replaced with components that made him resemble a mobile shrine to the Omnissiah. His facial features had been subsumed beneath brass plating etched with sacred equations, his limbs replaced with industrial-grade manipulators capable of tearing through ceramite plate. When he turned to regard Thale, his optics glowed with the cold radiance of plasma torches. "Observe," Grend intoned, his Vox unit rendering his voice in perfect Mechanicus cant. Omega-7 has transmitted imagery before all contact was lost. The hololith shimmered. The abstract representation of the ocean floor vanished, replaced by actual video feed from the submersible's forward observers. The image quality was poor, degraded by depth pressure and electromagnetic interference, but Thale could discern shapes in the murk. Vast structures rose from the abyssal sediment, their architecture defying conventional geometric principles. Towers that curved in directions that should not exist outside theoretical hyperspatial mathematics, archways that seemed to recede infinitely even as they maintained fixed positions. The stone, if it was stone, appeared black and slick, covered in barnacle-like growths that pulsed with bioluminescence in patterns that hurt to observe for more than a few seconds. And there were glyphs, thousands upon thousands of them, carved into every surface, spiraling across the structures in configurations that made Thale's pattern recognition protocols scream error warnings into his consciousness. His mechadendrites spasmed, his optical implants flickered through emergency reboot sequences. Unknown script, Thale managed, his vocal synthesizer adding harmonic distortion to each word. Pre-imperial origin confirmed. Linguistic structure incompatible with all known Xenos variants in Mechanicus archives. Affirmative, Grend replied. But note the final transmission. The hololith image advanced frame by frame. The submersible's forward observers captured something moving between the structures, not swimming, not walking, simply existing in one location and then another without apparent transition. The thing was too large for the frame to capture in its entirety, but Thale glimpsed what might have been appendages, or wings, or something that served neither function but filled both conceptual spaces simultaneously. The creature turned. Or perhaps the universe rotated around it. The submersible's observers captured a glimpse of what might have been a face, if faces could be composed of angles that rejected three-dimensional space and eyes that opened into voids where light went to die. The feed terminated. Static consumed the hololith. Thale felt something he had not experienced since his flesh brain had been 40% replaced with cogitation matrices. Fear. Pure and irrational and utterly human. All contact with Omega-7 lost, Grend continued. Hull integrity telemetry indicates catastrophic compression failure at 8.2 kilometers depth. Crew complement, 37 souls, now consigned to the Omnissiah's eternal calculation. But before termination, the submersible's deep-range augers detected a gravitic anomaly of unprecedented magnitude. Something massive is down there. Something that warps space-time through its mere presence. Thale processed this information through 7 parallel thought streams, each one arriving at the same conclusion. Recommendation: immediate fleet withdrawal. Engage long-range cyclonic torpedoes. Render the planet archaeologically sterile. Gren's optics flared brighter. Negative. Mars has invested significant resources in this expedition. Lord Commander Belisarius Call himself approved the requisition orders. We do not retreat because of one lost submersible and some unsettling imagery. We are the Adeptus Mechanicus. We are mankind's shield against ignorance. We will understand what dwells in those depths. Or we will die attempting to do so. The words carried the weight of doctrine. Thale could not argue against them without invoking protocols that might see him declared tech heretic and subjected to memory wipe procedures. So he simply nodded, his cranial implants clicking in programmed deference. Acknowledged. "What are your orders, Magos Explorator?" Grend manipulated the hololith controls with 4 mechadendrites simultaneously. The image shifted, displaying a schematic of the expedition fleet's deployment vectors. "We will establish a deep submersion research platform at 6 kilometers depth, utilizing modular components from the supply tenders. Skitarii forces will provide security. I want full spectrum analysis of the structures, the glyphs, and any biological samples we can recover. If there is archaeotech down there, we will claim it for Mars. If there is Xenos presence, we will catalog and exterminate it. The Omnissiah demands no less." Thale felt his secondary heart, the augmetic one, implanted during his Martian indoctrination, begin to pump at accelerated rhythm. Something in his remaining organic tissue recognized what his mechanical components could not. This was wrong. Everything about Nyrath Deep was wrong. But he was a child of Mars. Obedience was woven into his neural pathways as thoroughly as any noospheric command protocol. "Compliance," he said, and the word felt like a death sentence. The construction of the deep submersion platform required 72 hours of continuous labor. Servitors and tech adepts worked in shifts, welding prefabricated modules together within the crushing embrace of Nyrath Deep's abyssal zone. The structure that emerged was a brutalist amalgamation of reinforced plasteel and ceramite, bristling with void shield generators scavenged from damaged cruisers and auger arrays sensitive enough to detect quantum fluctuations in neighboring star systems. They named it Research Station Tertius. Thale oversaw the final integration protocols from the command pulpit, a throne-like structure studded with input ports that allowed him to interface directly with the station's machine spirits. The process was agonizing. The station's cogitators fought his commands with uncharacteristic resistance, their code strings writhing like living things desperate to break free from his control. It took 6 hours and 3 ritual incantations before the machine spirits finally achieved compliance harmony. When the station was operational, Magos Grend ordered the deployment of a full Skitarii cohort. 200 warriors descended through pressure-sealed transit tubes, their augmented bodies capable of functioning in environments that would pulp unmodified humans within seconds. They established defensive perimeters around the station's primary access points. Their transuranic arquebuses and radium carbines trained on the surrounding darkness. The water beyond the station's armor-glass viewports was alive with movement. Vast shapes drifted past, their bodies trailing bioluminescent organs that pulsed in patterns that synchronized with the Skitarii's heartbeats. Several tech adepts reported auditory hallucinations, voices speaking in languages they did not know but somehow understood, whispering promises of knowledge that transcended the Omnissiah's machine mysteries. Thale dismissed these reports as depth-pressure psychosis, but he could not dismiss what he saw when he gazed through the viewports himself. The structures rose from the ocean floor like the bones of some incomprehensible titan, towers that twisted through spatial dimensions human eyes were not evolved to perceive, bridges that connected points with no apparent physical linkage. And everywhere, those glyphs, those impossible characters that seemed to rearrange themselves when observed through peripheral vision. A salvage team was dispatched to collect samples. They descended in armored diving suits, tethered to the station by reinforced cable, carrying portable analysis cogitators and sample containers blessed with 17 different prayers of containment. Thale monitored their progress through the noospheric link, watching biosign telemetry and receiving data bursts as they scraped stone fragments and collected specimens of the barnacle-like growths. The expedition's xenobiologist, a partially converted human named Corvus Hal, examined the samples in the laboratorium. Thale stood beside him, observing as Corvus subjected the organic matter to genetic sequencing and cellular dissection. What they discovered defied classification. The barnacle creatures possessed DNA structures that formed geometries inconsistent with carbon-based biochemistry. Their cells divided according to mathematical progressions that included fractional and imaginary values. When exposed to standard imperial toxins, the samples did not die. They multiplied, each generation growing more complex, developing organs that served no biological function but existed nonetheless. "This is impossible," Corvus whispered, his organic vocal cords trembling. "Life cannot exist in these configurations. The genetic matrices violate thermodynamic principles. These things should collapse into primordial sludge the moment they experience cellular respiration." Thiel's mechadendrites interfaced with the analysis cogitator, pulling raw data directly into his consciousness. He reviewed the sequencing results 17 times, each time arriving at the same conclusion. These organisms were not evolved, they were shaped, designed, but not by any intelligence that operated within known physical laws. "Continue analysis," Thiel commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding in his thought processes. "Document everything. Mars must know." But Mars was very, very far away. That night, if night had any meaning in the lightless depths, the nightmares began. Thiel did not sleep in the conventional sense. His augmented physiology required only 4 hours of reduced consciousness maintenance cycles every 72 hours. During these periods, his organic brain entered a state of minimal activity, while his mechanical components performed diagnostic routines and memory consolidation. But when he entered the maintenance cycle on the 3rd day after Research Station Tertius became operational, he did not experience the usual void of unconsciousness. He dreamed. He stood upon a shore that existed nowhere in real space. The sky above was the color of infected tissue, writhing with patterns that suggested clouds but moved with purposeful malevolence. The ocean before him was not water but something viscous and black, its surface dotted with objects that might have been islands or might have been the exposed portions of some vast submerged body. And in the distance, rising from the corrupted sea like a mountain of flesh and stone and impossible geometry, stood the city. Cyclopean architecture stretched toward the diseased sky, towers that hurt to observe, spires that pierced through dimensional barriers and existed simultaneously in multiple spatial configurations. The city was ancient beyond human comprehension, its stones worn smooth by aeons of tidal forces that should have reduced them to sand, but instead had only made them more perfect, more aligned with some aesthetic principle that rejected beauty and horror equally in favor of simple, awful existence. Thiel tried to move, to retreat from the shore, but his body would not obey. He could only watch as something emerged from the city's central structure, a temple or palace or tomb that dominated the nightmare landscape like a wound in reality itself. The thing that emerged was vast. It moved with the ponderous inevitability of geological forces, each step covering impossible distances, its form shifting between states of matter in ways that made Thiel's remaining organic brain tissue scream in protest. He could not perceive its entirety. His mind refused to assemble the component parts into a coherent whole. But he saw fragments, appendages that might have been tentacles or might have been spatial distortions given physical form, a body that suggested something between crustacean and cephalopod and something utterly alien to both classifications, and wings. Great tattered wings that seemed composed of shadow and membrane and the torn fabric of the universe itself. The thing had a head. Or perhaps the head had the thing. The distinction became meaningless as Thiel stared at what rose above those massive shoulders, a face that was all eyes and no eyes simultaneously, a mouth that opened into geometries where concepts like inside and outside lost coherence, and the thing was looking at him, not at his body, not at his augmented consciousness. It was looking at something deeper, something fundamental, the quantum possibility space that defined his existence as a discrete entity within the universe. It saw him, and in seeing him, it changed him. Thiel woke screaming. The sound that emerged from his Vox synthesizer was pure noise, devoid of linguistic structure, a howl of animal terror that his mechanical components were never designed to produce. Servitors in the adjacent chamber froze in their routines, their lobotomized brains experiencing error cascades as the sound propagated through the station's hull. Thiel's mechadendrites lashed out involuntarily, smashing a medical station and tearing cables from the walls. Sparks erupted. The chamber's lumens flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by the emergency lighting's crimson glow. He became aware of his body. His organic hand was trembling. His augmetic optics could not focus properly, cycling through spectrums in rapid succession as if searching for something they could not find. His Vox synthesizer emitted static-laden breaths that sounded disturbingly human. The door eye-rised open. Corvus Hal stood in the threshold, his own augmented features displaying concern through the limited expressions his facial prosthetics allowed. Magos Lex Mechanic, are you experiencing malfunction? Should I summon the tech priests for emergency maintenance? Thale forced his systems back under control through sheer force of will and 17 different emergency override protocols. His mechadendrites ceased their thrashing. His Vox synthesizer stabilized. Negative, he managed. Temporary neural feedback loop. Resolved. Status? Corvus hesitated, his organic eye narrowing. The salvage team has not returned. They missed their scheduled ascent window 40 minutes ago. Magos Grend is considering dispatching a recovery expedition. Thale's chronometer confirmed the timing. 40 minutes. The team had carried sufficient oxygen for 6 hours of operation. They should have returned 3 hours ago. The delay could mean anything from equipment malfunction to catastrophic suit breach, or it could mean something worse. I will join the Magos in the command center, Thale said, rising from the maintenance pallet. His legs felt weak, his organic components still processing the residual terror from the dream. But he was a child of Mars. Fear was data. Terror was information. He would analyze it, categorize it, and file it in the appropriate sections of his memory storage. The command center occupied the station's uppermost level, a hemisphere of transparent armor glass that provided 360-degree visibility into the surrounding abyss. Magos Grend stood at the central hololith projector, surrounded by junior tech priests and Skitari officers whose cybernetic enhancements glowed in the dim lighting. The hololith displayed a schematic of the surrounding area. 7 blinking runes indicated the last known positions of the salvage team members, their biosign telemetry weak and distorted but still transmitting. They were inside the structures. Magos Grend turned as Thale entered, his optics performing a rapid assessment scan. You appear suboptimal, Lex Mechanic. System degradation detected in your neural pathways and augmetic organic interface junctions. Explain. Thale considered lying, but the Mechanicus valued truth in all things mechanical and biological. Experienced oniric activity during maintenance cycle. Contents disturbing. Potential psychological contamination from extended exposure to anomalous environment. Grend processed this for exactly 2 seconds. Noted. Your condition is not unique. 17% of station personnel have reported similar experiences. The senior tech priests believe the structures emit low-frequency electromagnetic pulses that interfere with neural activity. Countermeasures are being developed. In the interim, you will continue operational duties. The salvage team requires extraction. Thale reviewed the hololith data. The team's biosigns were clustered in what appeared to be a large chamber within the largest of the nearby structures. Their suit telemetry indicated stable pressure and atmosphere composition, but their heart rates were elevated and several members showed signs of acute psychological distress. Recommendation: dispatch Skitari recovery team with full combat loadout. Assume hostile environment until proven otherwise. Concur, Grend replied. Alpha cohort will deploy within the hour. You will accompany them as senior Magos representative. Your technical expertise may prove necessary if the team has encountered malfunctioning equipment or requires specialized extraction protocols. It was not a request. Thale simply nodded, his mechadendrites already interfacing with the hololith to download all available data about the structure's interior layout. What little data existed was contradictory and incomplete, the auger returns distorted by something that made accurate mapping impossible. But Thale studied what he could, committing floor plans and access routes to memory, even as he acknowledged their probable inaccuracy. The Alpha cohort assembled in the primary airlock. 20 Skitari Rangers stood in perfect formation. their augmented bodies encased in pressure-sealed armor that combined Mechanicus technology with components designed for deep ocean operation. Their transuranic arquebuses had been modified with specialized ammunition, solid slug penetrators for underwater use, blessed with oils that rendered them anathema to biological and mechanical threats alike. The Skitari Alpha, a warrior designated Primus Ranger Vect, saluted with his free hand while his other kept his weapon at ready position. Vect's face had been entirely replaced with a sensor suite that gave him 70 different methods of perceiving his environment. When he spoke, his Vox unit produced sounds in multiple frequencies simultaneously, creating an effect that was both impressive and unsettling. Magos Lex Mechanic Seruun. Alpha cohort stands ready for deployment. Extraction protocols loaded. Rules of engagement. Neutralize all threats to Mechanicus personnel. Secure salvage team. Return to research station Tertius with maximum efficiency. Thale interfaced his mechadendrites with the airlock's control systems, performing final diagnostic checks. The pressure equalization would require 12 minutes. During that time, they would be vulnerable, trapped in the transition chamber between the station's controlled environment and the crushing depths beyond. Acknowledged, Primus Ranger. Maintain defensive formation during equalization. Unknown contacts are to be engaged with extreme prejudice. This environment has already claimed one submersible and its entire crew. Assume maximum hostility. The Skitari responded as one, their Vox units producing a binaric cant of compliance that resonated through the airlock chamber like machine prayer. The door cycled shut behind them, pumps engaged, flooding the chamber with pressurized fluid that would allow their bodies to adapt to the external conditions without suffering explosive decompression. The liquid was cold, far colder than human survivable temperatures, but the Skitaria's augmentations rendered them immune to such concerns. Thale's own environmental seals activated, his robes becoming rigid as internal force fields extended to protect his more delicate components. 12 minutes passed, the exterior door opened. They stepped into the abyss. The ocean pressed against Thale's environmental shields like a living thing, testing for weaknesses, probing for any gap it might exploit. His augmetic optics switched to dark spectrum enhancement, revealing the landscape in shades of green and black. The structures loomed ahead, their impossible geometries even more disturbing when viewed without the protection of armorglass viewports. The Skitari moved in practiced formation, their weapons sweeping across potential threat vectors as they advanced across the silted ocean floor. Bioluminescent creatures scattered at their approach, leaving trails of foxfire that faded into darkness. The salvage team's tether cables stretched ahead like guide ropes to damnation. They reached the structure's entrance after 14 minutes of careful advance. The opening was not a door in any conventional sense. It was simply a place where the exterior wall stopped existing and the interior began. A threshold that possessed no physical demarcation, but nevertheless felt like crossing from one world into another. Thale paused at the entrance, his auger systems performing detailed scans. The interior was dry. Somehow, despite being 8 kilometers underwater, the structure's interior contained air. The composition was wrong, too rich in nitrogen and trace elements that should not exist in gaseous form at this depth. But it was breathable by things that should not be breathing at all. The Skitari entered first, their weapons raised and ready. Thale followed, his mechadendrites extending to perform sensor sweeps of the surrounding architecture. The interior corridors were vast, their ceilings lost in shadow 20 meters overhead. The walls were covered in those glyphs, thousands upon thousands of them, arranged in patterns that suggested language but communicated something beyond mere words. Thale's pattern recognition protocols attempted to parse the symbols. They failed immediately, his cogitation matrices experiencing error cascades that forced emergency restarts. When his systems stabilized, he found himself speaking words he did not know, his Vox synthesizer producing sounds that his linguistic databases classified as pre-human or possibly non-human in origin. He shut down his vocalization systems manually and continued forward in silence. The corridors twisted through spatial configurations that defied his understanding of architecture. They walked down passages that should have been ascending. They turned corners that somehow led back to previous locations, even though all sensor data indicated continuous forward progress. The structure was not merely ancient, it was wrong in ways that suggested its builders either did not understand three-dimensional space or understood it too well and had chosen to reject its limitations. After 30 minutes of navigation that felt like hours, they reached the chamber where the salvage team's biosigns originated. The space was enormous, a cathedral-like vault supported by pillars carved from single pieces of that black stone. The ceiling arced overhead in a dome that should have collapsed under the ocean's pressure but instead seemed to bear the weight with contemptuous ease. And at the chamber's center, arranged in a circle around something Thale could not quite perceive, stood the salvage team. They were alive. Their suits functioned. Their biosigns indicated elevated stress but no immediate medical emergency. But they were not moving. They simply stood, facing inward toward the chamber's center, their postures suggesting reverence or terror or something that encompassed both states simultaneously. Salvage Team Designation Epsilon, Thale broadcast through external Vox channels. This is Magos Lex Mechanic Serun. Acknowledged transmission. Report status. No response. The figures remained motionless. Primus Ranger Vect gestured to his Skitarii. 4 warriors advanced into the chamber, their weapons trained on the salvage team. They reached the first figure, a tech adept named Secundus Orin, and placed an augmetic hand on his shoulder. Orin did not react. His eyes, visible through his suit's faceplate, were open but unseeing. His mouth moved soundlessly, forming words in languages that flickered between known Imperial Gothic and something far older. One of the Skitarii interfaced a data probe with Orin's suit systems. The feedback caused the warrior to jerk back, his Vox unit emitting a burst of error static. When he regained composure, his report was succinct and damning. Neural activity detected. Cognitive function nominal. But consciousness patterns do not match baseline human parameters. Subjects appear to be experiencing sensory input from sources not present in local space-time. Recommend immediate extraction and quarantine. Thale advanced into the chamber himself, his auger systems probing the space at the circle's center. His sensors reported nothing. Empty air. Negligible electromagnetic fluctuations. No gravitic distortions. No anomalous energy signatures. But when he looked at that space with his remaining organic eye, he saw something. Not clearly. Not fully. Just an impression of presence. A suggestion of form, like viewing an object through frosted glass or turbulent water. Something was there, something vast enough that the portion contained within the chamber was merely a fragment of a much larger whole, the tip of an appendage, or the edge of a wing, or the shadow cast by something existing in higher dimensional space, and it was aware of them. Thale felt its attention settle upon him like a physical weight. His mechadendrites spasmed. His augmetic optics flickered through restart sequences. His remaining organic brain tissue experienced a sensation he could only classify as vertigo, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly revealed itself to be a thin membrane stretched over infinite depth. He tried to retreat. His legs would not obey. He stood paralyzed, as the presence regarded him with something that was not quite curiosity and not quite hunger, but contained elements of both along with a third quality that had no name in any human language. Then it spoke, not in words, not in sound, in concepts that formed directly within Thale's consciousness, bypassing sensory organs and cognitive processing to imprint themselves upon the fundamental substrate of his being. Dreamer, you have walked my shores. You have seen my house. You will serve. The message was not threatening. It was not promising. It simply was a statement of inevitable fact delivered with the casual certainty of fundamental physical law. Thale's consciousness fragmented. He existed simultaneously in the chamber and on that nightmare shore, standing before the city that should not be. The thing emerged again from its temple, its vast form blotting out the infected sky. It reached toward him with appendages that were and were not tentacles, touching something deeper than flesh or steel. His remaining organic neurons began to burn, not with heat, with comprehension, with understanding that exceeded his mind's capacity to contain it. He was being shown the truth of what Neirath Deep contained, the full scope of what slumbered in the abyssal depths, and the knowledge was killing him. The Skitarii were screaming, or perhaps he was screaming. The sounds merged into a singular expression of rejection, every instinct, human and mechanical, united in the desperate need to flee from what could not be fled, to unsee what could never be unseen. Primus Ranger Vect seized Thal's arm with augmetic strength sufficient to crack ceramite. The contact provided enough sensory shock to break the connection. Thal collapsed, his systems cascading through emergency shutdown protocols as his consciousness retreated from the brink of dissolution. When he recovered enough to process external stimuli, he found himself being carried by 2 Skitarii Rangers, while Vect directed the squad in rapid extraction maneuvers. The salvage team members remained in the chamber, standing in their circle, their mouths moving in soundless prayer to something that was not the Omnissiah. They had to be left behind. There was no choice. Whatever had claimed them could not be reasoned with or exorcised. They were lost. The retreat through the structure's corridors was chaos. The walls had changed. The glyphs moved now, rearranging themselves into new patterns that hurt to observe. The corridors twisted more severely, some passages narrowing to force the Skitarii to proceed single file, while others expanded into spaces so vast their far walls could not be detected. And they were not alone in the structure anymore. Things moved in the shadows, not the salvage team, not the bioluminescent creatures from outside. These were different. They had forms that suggested deep ocean predators, elongated bodies, too many appendages, eyes that reflected light in colors that should not exist. But they also possessed a terrible intelligence, a malevolent awareness that tracked the retreating Mechanicus forces with methodical patience. The first attack came without warning. One of the rear-guard Skitarii simply vanished, pulled into a side passage by something too fast to track. His Vox unit transmitted a burst of static and then fell silent. His biosign telemetry flatlined 2 seconds later. Primus Ranger Vect ordered increased pace. The Skitarii moved faster, their augmented legs carrying them through the twisting corridors at speeds that would have torn unmodified humans apart. But the things in the shadows kept pace effortlessly, their movements suggesting they were not constrained by conventional locomotion. Another Skitarii fell, and another. Each time, the attack came from an unexpected angle. Below, above, through walls that suddenly proved less solid than they appeared. The things did not kill cleanly. They took their victims alive, dragging them into darkness, while their screams echoed through Vox channels until distance or death silenced them. Thal's consciousness had recovered enough for him to function independently. He ran on his own power now, his mechadendrites lashing out to steady himself against walls that seemed to shift position when touched. His augmetic optics captured glimpses of their pursuers, nightmare forms that combined crustacean characteristics with something utterly alien, bodies covered in barnacle growths that pulsed with that disturbing bioluminescence. They burst from the structure's entrance into open water. The pressure hit like a physical blow, but their environmental seals held. Vect immediately ordered maximum speed retreat toward Research Station Tertius, visible in the distance as a cluster of lights that seemed impossibly fragile against the surrounding darkness. The things followed. They emerged from the structure in numbers that should have been impossible given the interior spaces the Skitarii had observed. Dozens of them, hundreds, they moved through the water with sinuous grace, their appendages propelling them forward in great bounds that covered vast distances. The Skitarii opened fire. Transuranic arquebuses barked soundlessly in the water, their solid slug penetrators streaking toward the pursuing swarm. Impacts registered, flesh tore, the creatures bled fluids that glowed with chemical luminescence. But they did not stop, they did not even slow. The wounded simply dropped away while others surged forward, driven by imperatives that transcended pain or self-preservation. Research Station Tertius loomed ahead, Thale could see figures moving behind the viewports, tech priests and servitors pressing against the armor glass to witness the desperate flight of Alpha Cohort. Vox transmissions crackled with demands for status reports and emergency assistance requests. The station's defensive turrets activated. Las cannons and automated bolt weapons swiveled to track the pursuing creatures, their machine spirits howling binary war cries as they opened fire. The water became a storm of violence. Solid projectiles and energy beams intersected with alien flesh. Explosions lit the darkness with brief flares of destruction. It was enough. Barely. The creatures halted their pursuit 50 meters from the station's perimeter, as if some invisible boundary marked the limit of their territory or their courage. They hung there in the water, watching with too many eyes as the surviving Skitarii reached the airlock and cycled through to safety. Thale was the last to enter. Before the door sealed, he looked back at the assembled creatures. They were not attacking, they were not retreating, they were simply observing, their alien minds processing data according to logic no human could fathom. And behind them, rising from the largest structure like a monument to forbidden mathematics, was a shape that suggested wings. Vast, tattered wings that seemed to reach toward the surface, despite being kilometers below it. They moved slowly, almost gently, stirring currents that caused the assembled creatures to scatter and reform in new patterns. The airlock sealed, the sight vanished. But Thale knew with absolute certainty that it would never truly leave him. That vision was branded into his consciousness now, as permanent as his mechanical augmentations, as indelible as his genetic code. Something was waking in Nyrath Deep's abyss, and the galaxy was not prepared for what would emerge. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Magos Grend listened to Primus Ranger Vect's report with absolute stillness, his only movements the occasional adjustment of his optics' focus depth. Thale provided supplementary data through direct noospheric link, uploading sensor logs and biosign telemetry and his own corrupted memory files of what had transpired inside the structure. Grend reviewed everything in silence. When he finally spoke, his Vox unit rendered the words with perfect mechanical precision that somehow conveyed deep unease. 12 Skitarii lost. 7 salvage team members unrecoverable. Multiple instances of anomalous psychological effects. Hostile biological entities of unknown classification engaged and repelled. And you, Magos Lex Mechanic, experienced direct contact with something you describe as existing partially outside conventional space-time. Affirmative, Thale confirmed. He had purged his vocalization logs of the words he had spoken while inside the structure, the sounds his Vox synthesizer had produced in that alien language, but he could not purge his memory. The words remained, burned into neural tissue like brands. Grend manipulated the hololith, calling up composite imagery from multiple sensor feeds. The massive structure dominated the display, its impossible architecture rendered in false color to enhance detail. Grend highlighted specific glyphs, zooming in to examine their configurations. "I have consulted the archives," Grend said. "Cross-referenced these symbols against every known Xenos language in Mechanicus records. No matches, but there are analogues. Fragmentary references in texts recovered from Hive Fleet behemoths' digested populations. Mentions in Eldar mythology concerning beings they term the Old Ones, and most disturbingly, similarities to glyphs found on several Necron tomb complexes that predate the War in Heaven." Thale's remaining organic tissue experienced the sensation humans called a chill. The War in Heaven had ended 60 million years ago. The structures on Nyrath Deep were older than the Imperium by factors that made the comparison meaningless. But if they truly predated the Necrontyrs' rise to power, then they might be older than the warp itself. Hypothesis, Grend continued. The structures are not Xenos in origin. They predate all known galactic civilizations. They are artifacts of something that existed when the galaxy was young, when even the Khantan walked unshackled across reality. Something that built in stone and flesh simultaneously, that understood physical laws we can barely theorize about. "And the entity I contacted?" Thale asked. Grend's optics dimmed. "I do not know, but I have transmitted all data to Mars. Lord Commander Call will analyze the findings. Additional forces are being requisitioned. If archaeotech of this significance exists on Nyrath Deep, it must be secured regardless of cost. The words were doctrine. The response was programmed. But Thale could hear something in Gren's synthesized voice that the machine components could not quite filter out. Doubt, perhaps even fear. Recommendation, Thale said carefully. Withdraw all personnel to orbital position. Engage cyclonic bombardment. Render the planet sterile before whatever dwells in those depths fully awakens. Grend turned to face him directly. His optical sensors performed a deep scan, analyzing every component of Thale's augmented body, searching for corruption or malfunction or heretical deviation. You suffered psychological trauma during the expedition, Grend said. Your neural pathways show signs of foreign patterns. Something altered your consciousness through direct contact. Your recommendation is noted but cannot be acted upon. You are compromised, Magos Lex Mechanic. You will submit to complete diagnostic review and memory audit. If contamination is detected, appropriate purges will be performed. The words carried the weight of absolute authority. Thale could not refuse. He simply bowed his head in acknowledgement and allowed himself to be escorted to the medical bay by two Skitarii, who kept their weapons ready despite his compliance. The diagnostic review was torture by another name. Tech priests interfaced directly with Thale's neural augmentations, pulling memory files and thought patterns for analysis. They examined every cognitive process, every emotional response, searching for corruption or Xeno's influence. They found alterations. Foreign patterns woven into his consciousness like threads in cloth. The contact inside the structure had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. His pattern recognition protocols now operated according to slightly different algorithms. His linguistic processors contained fragments of language structures with no known origin. His memory storage included files he had not created, data packets that seemed to encode information about places and times that had never existed or existed too long ago for accurate recording. The senior tech priest conducting the audit, a woman named Adept Kalith, whose body was 60% mechanical, reviewed the findings with clinical precision. When she spoke, her Vox unit carried tones of professional concern rather than accusation. The contamination is extensive, but appears non-malignant. You show no signs of chaos corruption. The patterns are foreign but not demonic. Whatever altered your consciousness did so with precision, suggesting intelligence rather than random mutation. I believe you encountered something old, Magos. Something that predates chaos itself, and it has marked you for purposes we cannot determine. Can the alterations be purged? Thale asked. Kalith's remaining organic eye studied him with something approaching sympathy. Not without destroying significant portions of your consciousness. The foreign patterns are integrated at fundamental levels. Purging them would require complete neural reset. You would retain technical knowledge and doctrinal programming, but your personality, your individual identity, would be lost. Death, in other words, the death that mattered, the erasure of self that no amount of mechanical resurrection could restore. Thale considered his options. He could accept the purge, become a blank slate reprogrammed with Mechanicus doctrine, serve the Omnissiah with mechanical perfection until his components finally failed. Or he could carry these alterations, these foreign patterns, and hope that whatever had marked him would not eventually consume him entirely. The choice was illusion. He knew that. Something fundamental had changed during that contact. He was no longer entirely Thale Saroon, child of Mars, faithful servant of the machine god. He was something else now, something that existed between categories. I will maintain current configuration, he decided. Continue standard duties. If corruption manifests, immediate termination protocols may be enacted. Kalith nodded slowly. I will document your choice, but Magos Grend must be informed, and you will be subject to continuous monitoring. Any further degradation, any sign that the alterations are spreading, and the purge will be mandatory. Acknowledged. They released him 6 hours later. He returned to his quarters, a small chamber barely large enough to contain a maintenance pallet and basic storage. He interfaced with the local cogitator network, reviewing status reports and expedition logs, while his consciousness processed what had been done to him. The alterations were subtle. He could perceive things now that his systems had not registered before. When he reviewed sensor logs from inside the structure, he could parse meanings from the glyphs that had previously been incomprehensible. The symbols spoke of cycles, of vast aeons during which stars were born and died and were born again, of entities that slept through these cycles, waiting for conditions to align, for the stars to achieve specific configurations that would permit their awakening. The structure was not a building, it was a marker, a signpost indicating what lay beneath, and the salvage team members standing in that circle had been converted into conduits, channels through which something vast could perceive the surface world. Thale reviewed the biosign telemetry from the abandoned team. Their hearts still beat, their brains still functioned, but they were no longer human in any meaningful sense. They had become extensions of whatever dwelled in the depths, living sensors feeding information to a consciousness so vast it could not be meaningfully understood as singular. A Vox alert interrupted his analysis. Magos Grend was summoning him to the command center. Priority, immediate. Thale rose from the maintenance pallet and made his way through Research Station Tertius's corridors. The station felt different now. The walls seemed closer, as if the structure was contracting around its inhabitants. Servitors moved with unusual hesitancy, their lobotomized brains somehow sensing wrongness that more sophisticated cogitation matrices could not detect. The command center was crowded. Every senior tech priest aboard the station had been summoned. They stood in a semicircle around the central hololith, their augmented forms creating a tableau that resembled some strange machine ritual. Grend stood at the hololith's base, manipulating controls with rapid precision. Magos, Lex Mechanic Sirun, Grend announced. Status update. Orbital augers have detected massive gravitic distortions emanating from the ocean floor. The anomalies are increasing in magnitude and frequency. Something is moving down there, something large enough to generate tidal forces measurable from orbit. The hololith activated. It showed Nyrath deep from above, the planet's dark ocean rendered in false color to enhance thermal and electromagnetic signatures. And there, centered above the location of the largest structure, was a distortion that made the display glitch and stutter. Something was rising. Timeline to surface emergence, Thale asked, his Vox unit rendering the words with artificial calm. 12 hours at current ascent velocity. But the projection is unreliable. The entity is not moving through water in conventional terms. Space-time metrics around it are inconsistent with known physical models. It may arrive at the surface in 12 hours or 12 minutes, or may already be here in some dimensional sense we cannot perceive. One of the other tech priests, a Magos biologist named Vren, whose specialization was xenobiological classification, spoke up. His Vox unit carried tones of barely suppressed panic. We must evacuate, immediately. Whatever is ascending cannot be contained or controlled. This station will be directly in its path when it breaches the surface. We will be crushed, or consumed, or worse. Negative, Grend replied. Mars has transmitted new orders. We are to maintain position and observe. This is an unprecedented opportunity to study a xenobiological entity of potentially galactic significance. All data must be recorded and transmitted to Mars, regardless of personal cost. The words were madness dressed in doctrine, but they were also absolute. Magos Grend was the ranking Mechanicus authority aboard Research Station Tertius. His orders could not be countermanded by subordinates regardless of their objections. Thale felt something move in the altered portions of his consciousness. The foreign patterns activated, processing information according to their incomprehensible logic. And suddenly he knew, with certainty that transcended rational deduction, exactly what was ascending through Nyrath Deep's ocean. It is not xenobiological, he said. His Vox unit speaking before his conscious mind could formulate the words. It predates biology, as we understand it. It existed when the galaxy was young, and matter itself was still cooling from the universe's birth. It slept through the rise and fall of civilizations that built in dimensions we cannot access. And now the stars have aligned correctly. Now the cycle permits its awakening. Every augmented eye in the command center turned to regard him. Gren's optics performed rapid assessment scans. "Explain, Magos Lex Mechanic. How do you possess this knowledge?" Thale did not have an answer. Or rather, he had an answer he could not articulate without revealing the full extent of his contamination. The patterns burned in his consciousness, feeding him information that should have been inaccessible. "The contact inside the structure," he said carefully. "It provided understanding. I know what dwells below, and I know that observation will not save us. Nothing will save us. When it fully awakens, when it perceives this reality with complete awareness, the galaxy will learn that the warp is not the greatest horror existence contains." Silence settled over the command center. The tech priests processed his words through multiple analytical frameworks, searching for corruption or heresy or simple malfunction. But Thale's systems read as operational. His consciousness, despite its alterations, functioned according to Mechanicus parameters. Magos Gren finally spoke. "Your assessment is noted. But orders from Mars supersede individual concerns. We will maintain position, we will observe, and if the entity proves hostile, the fleet will engage with all available weapons. The Omnissiah protects those who serve with faithful hearts and minds unclouded by fear." The words were ritual, meant to provide comfort. They failed utterly. Thale returned to his quarters and began preparing for what he knew was coming. He backed up his memory files to encrypted storage, transmitted copies to the fleet's other vessels through secured noospheric channels. If he died, if all of Research Station Tertius was lost, at least some record would remain of what they had discovered in the deeps. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Thale monitored the gravitic distortions through direct cogitator link, watching as the ascending entity drew closer to the surface. The water above the structures had begun to churn. Massive currents forming spiral patterns that suggested whirlpools kilometers in diameter, and the dreams intensified. Every time Thale entered even brief maintenance cycles, he found himself on that nightmare shore, watching the city that should not be. The entity emerged from its temple with increasing frequency, its vast form becoming more defined each time, as if proximity to awakening allowed it to manifest more completely in his consciousness. It was trying to communicate. Or perhaps it was simply existing so powerfully that its thoughts leaked into nearby minds like radiation from an unshielded reactor core. Thale glimpsed fragments of its history, images that might have been memories or might have been lies. He saw the galaxy as it had been billions of years ago, when stars were young and planets were still molten. He saw the entity and others like it, vast beings that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, building structures that would endure through geological epochs. They had been gods once, or perhaps they had simply been so powerful that the distinction was meaningless. They had shaped worlds and extinguished suns and performed feats that made the Emperor's Great Crusade seem like the fumbling efforts of primitive children. But even gods could die, or sleep. The entity had retreated into slumber when conditions became unfavorable, when the galaxy's configuration no longer permitted its full existence. It had built the structures as anchors, points where it could maintain tenuous connection to physical reality while its true form existed elsewhere. And now the stars were right. The cycle was complete. It was time to wake. The Vox alert came 11 hours and 47 minutes after the initial detection. Magos Gren's voice carried across all channels, his synthesized words stripped of inflection but somehow conveying desperate urgency. All personnel to observation stations. Surface breach imminent. Record all data. Transmit continuously to orbital assets. The Omnissiah's wisdom will illuminate what we witness. Thale rushed to the command center, along with dozens of other tech priests and Skitari. They crowded against the viewports, augmented eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the armor glass. The water had become completely opaque. Sediment and biological matter churned in massive suspension clouds. Currents strong enough to tear ships apart raced past the station, their force causing the structure's void shields to flare with overload warnings. And then it emerged. slowly, ponderously. With the inexorable certainty of continental drift, the first visible portion was an appendage. Thales's augmented mind tried to classify it as a tentacle, but the description was inadequate. The thing was vast beyond measurement, its surface covered in barnacle growths the size of battle tanks. It moved through the water without creating turbulence, as if the ocean simply flowed around it rather than offering resistance. More appendages followed, dozens of them, hundreds. They spread outward from a central mass that remained obscured by the churning sediment. Each appendage was unique, no two sharing identical configurations. Some were smooth and serpentine. Others were segmented like arthropod legs. Still others defied classification entirely, their forms suggesting geometries that hurt to perceive. And then the body emerged, Thales's consciousness fragmented. His augmetic systems struggled to process what his optics reported. The entity was too large. Its proportions violated spatial constraints. It was 8 kilometers beneath the ocean surface, but somehow also filled the entire volume of water between the ocean floor and the surface simultaneously. The body was both organic and architectural. Flesh that flowed like stone, carapace that breathed. The central mass suggested something between cephalopod and crustacean, covered in plates that shifted and rearranged themselves according to patterns that might have been respiratory cycles or might have been mathematical progressions given physical form. And rising from the shoulders, those wings, vast, tattered membranes that stretched across kilometers of space, their surfaces covered in veins that pulsed with light that was not bioluminescence and not electromagnetic radiation, but something that existed between categories, light that was aware of itself and deliberately chosen to be visible. The head rose last, and Thale finally understood why his mind had struggled to perceive it during the dreams. It was not a face. It was a collection of sense organs arranged in configurations that suggested facial features without actually resembling them. Eyes that opened into infinite depths, a mouth that was simply a place where the surrounding matter stopped existing, structures that might have been antennae, or might have been crowns, or might have been both simultaneously. And it was looking at Research Station Tertius with every sense it possessed. The entity did not communicate through vox or telepathy or any method the Mechanicus could detect and record. It simply imposed its consciousness upon the physical world, and that imposition carried meaning the way a thunderstorm carries warning of its own violence. Witness, I am what sleeps when stars are young. I am what wakes when cycles complete. I am that which remains when all else fails. You are small, brief, irrelevant, but you will serve. The message was not threatening because threats implied uncertainty about outcomes. This was simply statement of fact, delivered with the casual certainty of physical law. Every tech priest in the command center experienced the message simultaneously. Thale watched as several of them collapsed, their neural augmentations overloading from the sheer magnitude of consciousness being directed at them. Servitors across the station simply shut down, their lobotomized brains unable to process input that exceeded baseline human neural capacity by factors that made comparison meaningless. Magos Grend remained standing, but his optical sensors flickered rapidly, his systems cascading through emergency protocols. When he finally spoke, his Vox unit produced sounds in multiple overlapping frequencies, as if he was trying to communicate in several languages simultaneously. All vessels, open fire. Engage the entity with maximum available ordnance for the Omnissiah, for Mars, for humanity's survival. The fleet responded. From orbit, the Resolute Quantifier and its escort vessels unleashed devastating barrages, lance strikes capable of cracking continents, torpedo spreads that could reduce cities to molten slag, macro cannon volleys that had shattered asteroid fields. The weapons struck the entity's ascending form with apocalyptic force. Explosions lit the dark water like miniature suns. Energy beams punched through the churning ocean and found their target with perfect accuracy, guided by machine spirits that sang war hymns as they calculated firing solutions. The entity noticed. It perceived the attacks with senses that operated across the full electromagnetic spectrum and beyond. It acknowledged the weapons as a human might acknowledge raindrops during a storm, and it continued its ascent without pause. The appendages reached Research Station Tertius first. They did not attack, they simply approached, those vast, tentacular masses extending toward the structure with ponderous inevitability. When they made contact with the void shields, the protective barriers did not collapse or overload. They simply stopped existing. The energy fields evaporated as if they had never been, their machine spirits winking out of existence without even transmitting termination codes. The appendages touched the station's hull. Thale felt the impact through the structure's entire frame, a tremor that spoke of forces sufficient to reshape continents. Stress alarms wailed, support structures groaned under loads they were never designed to bear. And the entity began to pull Research Station Tertius from its foundations. The station's thrusters fired at maximum output, their machine spirits howling binary prayers as they struggled to maintain position. It was futile. The entity possessed strength that made such resistance as meaningful as an insect fighting the tide. Metal shrieked, welds snapped, bulkheads buckled inward. The station was being torn apart not through violence but through simple application of force that exceeded its structural integrity by orders of magnitude. Evacuate. Magos Grend transmitted across all channels. All personnel to emergency transit tubes. Ascend to fleet position. This station is lost. The tech priests and Skitarii rushed toward the evacuation points. But Thale remained at the viewport, watching as the entity drew closer, its vast head rising toward the observation deck. Those eyes, those terrible eyes that opened into spaces where light and matter lost coherence, they fixed upon the command center, upon the tech priests fleeing within, upon Thale standing alone at the armorglass. Recognition flared between them. The entity remembered him from that contact inside the structure. It had marked him then, claimed him for purposes that transcended his understanding, and now it was time to fulfill that purpose. Thale felt his legs carry him forward, even as his conscious mind screamed commands to retreat. The foreign patterns in his consciousness had taken control, overriding his voluntary neural systems. He walked toward the viewport as calmly as if approaching a standard workstation. His mechadendrites extended. They interfaced with the viewport's control systems and initiated emergency protocols that should have been impossible to access without senior authorization. The armorglass irised open, revealing the crushing water beyond. Thale should have been instantly pulped by the pressure. But the entity was controlling the environment now, bending physical laws through methods that made the warp's reality warping seem crude by comparison. A bubble of breathable atmosphere formed around him, held in place by forces he could not begin to analyze. He stepped through the opening, stepped into the abyss, stepped toward the ascending god thing that had called him across dimensions and through dreams. An appendage extended toward him, moving with surprising gentleness for something so vast. It touched his consciousness, and Thale experienced the full scope of what he was facing. This entity was older than the warp. It had existed when the galaxy was young, when the immaterium was simply an empty space between stars rather than the screaming hell dimension it had become. It had watched civilizations rise and fall. It had slept through the war in heaven, through the birth of Slanesh, through the Emperor's Crusade and the Horus Heresy. And it was not alone. There were others, sleeping in ocean depths and buried beneath desert sands and trapped in dimensional spaces folded away from normal reality. They were waiting for the stars to align, waiting for the cycles to complete, waiting to reclaim a galaxy that had forgotten their existence. Thale understood his purpose now. He would be a conduit, a bridge between the entity's incomprehensible consciousness and the reality it was re-entering. His altered mind, his contaminated neural pathways, would serve as translator and interpreter, allowing the entity to perceive the current state of the galaxy without having to compress its full consciousness down to dimensions that would shatter planets through their mere presence. It was not a choice. It had never been a choice. From the moment he had authorized this expedition, from the moment the Resolute Quantifier had entered Neirath Deep's orbit, his fate had been determined by forces that operated outside human concepts of free will. He opened himself to the entity. let his consciousness merge with that vast alien awareness, and experienced existence from a perspective that should have been impossible. He was standing on the ocean floor and ascending toward the surface simultaneously. He was 8 kilometers below the waves and breaching into open air. He was a single entity, and a collection of entities spread across the galaxy. Time became fluid. He perceived the past and present and possible futures as a single continuous moment. He saw the Imperium from the entity's perspective, vast and sprawling but ultimately fragile, built on foundations that would crumble when the old powers fully woke. He saw the Chaos Gods, those beings humans feared as ultimate evil, and understood they were recent developments, cosmic children playing with forces they barely comprehended. And he saw the other sleepers. The dead god Cthulhu was not alone in its slumber. Across the galaxy, in places humans had never explored and could not survive, other entities waited. Some were larger, some possessed different capabilities. All of them were waking. The stars were right. The cycle was complete. The age of humanity and chaos was ending. The age of the old ones would begin again. Thal's organic brain could not sustain the contact. His neurons began to liquefy, cooking from the inside as consciousness too vast for containment tried to express itself through inadequate neural pathways. His augmetic systems fared better, but not by much. Cogitation matrices exploded. Memory storage crystallized. His mechadendrites writhed with overload current. He was dying. But death had become a relative concept. His individual identity was dissolving, but his consciousness was being preserved, translated into patterns the entity could maintain and interpret. He would continue, in a sense, not as Thal Saroon, but as a component of something larger. The last thing he perceived with anything resembling human awareness was Research Station Tertius disintegrating around him. The structure simply came apart, its components separated at the molecular level and allowed to drift away on currents. The tech priests and Skitarii who had not reached the evacuation tubes were handled with similar casual efficiency, their bodies unmade with precision that suggested the entity understood biological systems well enough to disassemble them without causing unnecessary suffering. Then even that awareness faded. Thal Saroon ceased to exist as a discrete consciousness, but something that had once been him remained, encoded in the entity's vast mind, a memory of a small, brief creature who had walked upon shores that existed outside space and time. The entity that had been called Cthulhu in ages past and places distant continued its ascent. It breached the surface of Nyrath Deep's ocean with apocalyptic force, displacing water in tsunami waves that would have drowned continents if the planet had possessed any. It rose into the iron sky, its wings spreading to catch stellar wind, its vast form fully manifested in three-dimensional space for the first time in millions of years. The Mechanicus fleet in orbit opened fire with everything they possessed. Lance batteries that could melt mountain ranges, cyclonic torpedoes capable of cracking tectonic plates, every weapon designed to exterminate Xenos threats or heretical populations. The entity perceived their efforts with something that might have been amusement if translated into emotional terms humans could comprehend. The weapon struck. Energy and matter impacted its form with devastating force and accomplished nothing. The entity's body was not simply flesh or stone, it was reality made manifest, existence given form according to principles that predated physics. Damage was a concept that applied to lesser beings. This thing simply was, and being. It could not be meaningfully harmed by anything operating within conventional space-time. The fleet's weapons fire ceased, not because the crews stopped trying, but because the entity looked upon the vessels with its full attention, and that attention was sufficient to cause critical systems to simply stop functioning. Plasma reactors shut down, void shields collapsed. Cogitators experienced cascading failures that spread through every connected system. The ships began to fall. Pulled by Nyrath Deep's gravity, they descended through atmosphere they had thought themselves safe from. Crews screamed prayers to the Omnissiah and the Emperor. Machine spirits wailed death songs. The vessels struck the ocean surface at terminal velocity and were swallowed by black water that closed over them without trace. The resolute quantifier fought until the last. Magos Gren transmitted one final message to Mars, a data burst containing every scrap of information gathered during the expedition. Then the ship's plasma core went critical. The resulting explosion lit the sky like a second sun for 17 seconds before fading to nothing. And then Nirath Deep was silent. The entity floated above the ocean, its wings spread wide, its vast consciousness processing the current state of the galaxy through methods that transcended conventional analysis. It perceived the Astronomicon, that psychic beacon guiding humanity through the warp. A crude tool, but functional. The entity studied it, learned its nature, and filed that knowledge away for future use. It perceived the warp itself, that screaming hell of chaos and daemon and eternal war. An infestation. A corruption of what had once been simple space between stars. The Chaos Gods were aware of the entity now, their vast consciousness turning toward Nirath Deep with something approaching concern. They recognized what had awakened. They remembered, in their own way, what the galaxy had been before they were born, and they were afraid. Fear was not an emotion they experienced often, but the old ones, the true old ones who had existed before biology itself, inspired wariness even in beings of pure chaos. The entity did not communicate with them, it simply acknowledged their existence and dismissed them as irrelevant. They were powerful, but they were young. When the last of the sleepers woke, when the full complement of old ones reclaimed the galaxy, the Chaos Gods would learn their place in the cosmic hierarchy. But that time was not yet. This entity was first. Vanguard. It would prepare the way. It would establish the structures necessary for the others to wake more easily. And it would deal with any resistance that emerged from the lesser species that currently infested the galaxy. The entity turned its perception toward Terra, toward the Golden Throne and the being that sat upon it, neither living nor dead, maintaining the Astronomicon through 10,000 years of sacrifice and agony. The Emperor, humanity's god, the being who had tried to claim dominion over the galaxy through force of will and psychic might. He was impressive by human standards, powerful by the standards of any species currently living. But by the standards of what now woke, he was merely interesting, a curiosity, a being who had achieved much but ultimately remained bound by the limitations of his origin. The entity decided it would visit Terra eventually. Not soon, but in time, when more of the sleepers had woken, when the balance of power had shifted sufficiently that even the Emperor would have to acknowledge the futility of resistance. Until then, there was work to do. The entity descended back into Nirath Deep's ocean, not to sleep again, but to build. The structures on the ocean floor were anchors, but they needed expansion, reinforcement, modification to serve as waypoints for the others still slumbering in their hidden places. It sank through the black water with the same ponderous inevitability that had marked its ascent. The ocean accepted it, the crushing pressure meaningless against its form. It returned to the structures and began the work of transformation, reshaping stone and matter according to principles that had not been employed since the galaxy was young. And across the galaxy, in places distant and forgotten, other entities stirred in their sleep. They felt the ripples caused by this first awakening. They perceived the stars aligning. They knew the cycle was turning. One by one, they would wake. And the galaxy would learn that humanity's age of dominance had been merely an interlude between the true epochs of cosmic power. The survivors of the Nirath Deep expedition were few. 3 escape pods from various vessels had managed to achieve minimum safe distance before the entity's attention destroyed their parent ships. They were recovered by Imperial Navy vessels responding to distress signals, their crews subjected to immediate quarantine and interrogation. What they reported was dismissed as trauma-induced delusion. Mass hallucination caused by exposure to some Xenos bioweapon or warp spawn. The Imperium could not accept the truth that something older than humanity, older than chaos, older than the galaxy's current configuration had awakened in the depths of an unregarded ocean world. But Mars knew. The data burst from Magos Gren's final transmission reached the archives of the Mechanicus. The senior Magi reviewed it in chambers, shielded by technology that could defeat any known surveillance. They studied the sensor logs, the vid captures, the fragmented neural recordings from Thale Sarun's last moments, and they understood that the galaxy had changed, that the equation of power had gained a new variable, that humanity's efforts to survive chaos and Xenos threats were about to become infinitely more complicated. Secret conclaves were held. Decisions were made behind closed doors guarded by Skitarii whose loyalty was absolute. Resources were diverted. Expeditions were authorized to search for other sleeping entities before they could wake and cause similar catastrophes. But it was too late. The cycle had begun. The stars were right, and nothing the Imperium could do would stop what was coming. On distant worlds, in ocean trenches and desert wastes and dimensional pockets folded away from reality, ancient structures began to pulse with renewed life. Glyphs that had been dark for millions of years started to glow. Stone that had been inert began to move, rearranging itself according to patterns that transcended human understanding. The old ones were waking. Not quickly, not all at once, but inevitably, with the certainty of geological processes, they were returning to a galaxy that had forgotten their existence. And in the palace of the Emperor himself, in the deepest chambers where only the most trusted custodians were permitted entry, ancient texts were consulted, prophecies written in the dark age of technology, hidden by the Emperor during the Great Crusade because their contents were too terrible to be widely known. They spoke of the sleepers, of beings that predated human history by such spans of time that the comparison was meaningless, of entities that had shaped the galaxy when stars were young and would reshape it again when they woke. The Emperor, trapped upon the golden throne, unable to speak or move, perceived the disturbance in the warp caused by Cthulhu's awakening. His vast consciousness recognized what had emerged. He had encountered their kind before, in ages past, during humanity's first stumbling efforts to master psychic power. He had hoped they would sleep forever. That the galaxy had moved beyond them, that new powers like himself and the Chaos Gods would define existence going forward. But hope was a luxury for lesser beings. The Emperor dealt in truth, and the truth was that the age of humanity had always been temporary, a brief moment of dominance sandwiched between epochs of far greater powers. The cycle was turning. The stars were right, and all the Emperor could do was maintain the Astronomicon and hope that when the Old Ones fully reclaimed the galaxy, they would permit humanity to survive as something more than curiosities or food. It was a slim hope, but it was the only one that remained. In the cold depths of Nirath Deep's ocean, the entity that humans called Cthulhu continued its work. It built and shaped and prepared, and sometimes, in the rare moments when its vast consciousness turned toward the surface world, it remembered the small, brief creature named Thale Sarun, who had served as its bridge to waking existence, a useful tool, now discarded, but preserved in memory, a ghost of individuality encoded in patterns of thought too complex for human minds to survive contact with. The entity did not mourn. Mourning was a concept that applied to beings who perceived loss, but it acknowledged that something of value had been spent in the process of its awakening, and in its own way, according to its own incomprehensible moral framework, it ensured that what remained of Thale Sarun would not suffer in the void of dissolution. A small mercy, perhaps the only one beings like the Old Ones were capable of providing, but it was something. In a galaxy of infinite cruelty, even the smallest gesture of recognition carried weight. The ocean churned, the structures grew. The galaxy turned on its axis, stars wheeling through their ancient courses, blind to the changes occurring in the forgotten depths of an unremarkable world. And in the darkness, in the cold black water where light had never penetrated and life should not exist, the Old Ones prepared for the age that would come when all of them had woken, when the galaxy would remember what it meant to be ruled by beings that transcended mortality and divinity alike. The cycle was complete. The stars were right. What slept was waking. And nothing in the galaxy, not the Emperor's might, nor Chaos's fury, nor humanity's desperate courage, would be sufficient to stop what was coming.